afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our program this evening, Advances in Alzheimer's and Dementia Science, Emerging Risk Factors and Treatments. A few quick housekeeping notes before we get started. We are in webinar format this evening, so you do not have the ability to control your camera or microphone. However, you can use the chat and the Q&A features in your Zoom toolbar to post any questions along the way during Dr. Griffin's presentation. And we will also, at the end of Dr. Griffin's presentation, we will be offering a Q&A session. With that being said, it is my pleasure to turn our program over to our Region 13 leader and Delaware Valley Chapter Executive, Christina Franzano.
Thank you so much, Kelly. It is such a pleasure to be with you all this evening. Welcome to Advances in Alzheimer's and Dementia Science. In recognition of Alzheimer's and Brain Awareness Month, we are canvassing our 3-state footprint across New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. So much of this month is really about educating our communities, engaging with each of you in an effort to raise awareness and connect more people to our resources. Today, I'm so proud to share that we were at the Pennsylvania State Capitol talking with legislative staff about a new appropriation to implement state infrastructure that will address the challenges of the public health crisis that is dementia. I thank so many of the volunteers who are here with us this evening, who are also with us here today. I'm thrilled to share we will be doing the same thing this upcoming Thursday at the Delaware State Capitol, and I look forward to being with so many of you volunteers there too. In addition to that, throughout this entire month, you will see us taking to media and all different advertising outlets to talk about the 10 warning signs of dementia and really to encourage a nationwide dialogue about dementia and Alzheimer's disease. This evening, we are so proud as part of that overall awareness building effort, educational effort, to host more than 300 individuals from across our 3-state footprint to hold this webinar. And we thank you all so much for your time and for being with us this evening. Your Alzheimer's Association is a global research force. At any given moment, someone somewhere in the world is advancing research. And thanks to the association, researchers are working around the clock to find answers and solutions to dementia and Alzheimer's disease. I am so thrilled to share with you that Dr. Percy Griffin is here with us this evening. He's our association's Director of Scientific Engagement. And through that work, he leads efforts to accelerate the organization's scientific agenda. He does that through ongoing development of education, research education. He engages with all of our chapters across the country, our volunteers, our staff, and the general public to help us raise up awareness about the role we are playing in research and to develop understanding about the research being done. Dr. Griffin, prior to joining the association, was a strategic analyst for PuroHit Navigation, a consultant for the Biotechnology and Life Sciences Advising Group, and a scientific editor and illustrator for Imprint. As a researcher as well, Dr. Griffin has led independent translational projects in Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. He holds a doctorate in molecular cell biology from Washington University in St. Louis, a master's degree in pharmacology from the University of Minnesota Medical School, and a bachelor's degree in biology and chemistry from Macalester College. We are so proud to have him as part of our nationwide and global team, and we are so happy to have you here this evening with us, Dr. Griffin. It is now my privilege and honor to turn the program and the virtual podium over to you.
Thank you so much, Christina. I'm going to take a second here to share my screen, and hopefully you all can see my screen. So thank you for that fantastic introduction, Christina. And thank you for having me here tonight. I know it's late for some of you, so thanks for tuning in to hear more about Alzheimer's and some of the emerging risk factors and how we're changing our understanding of the disease and how it progresses, as well as some of the potential treatments that are coming down the pipeline. So before I get started, I always like to start my talks with this slide of our vision as an organization is to see a world without Alzheimer's and all other dementia. And this is what drives us in our relentless pursuit of effective therapies for people living with Alzheimer's and other dementia, as well as risk reduction strategies to combat this devastating disease. So if you or someone you know is looking for more information, please visit alz.org or call our 1-800 number at 1-800-272-3900. Now, just to kind of give us a roadmap of where we're going in this talk today, I'm going to start with talking about the landscape of what the disease looks like, what it is versus what it's not, and also give some highlights in some of the advances we've made in terms of our understanding of risk reduction, early detection and diagnosis, and some of the clinical trials that are ongoing right now in the space. Now, before I dive into all of the fantastic science that's going on, as you heard Christina say, the Alzheimer's Association is truly a driving force in helping move forward research in the world. We are the largest nonprofit funder of Alzheimer's and all other dementia research in the world, with over $300 million committed or active across 920 projects in 45 countries to make projects bigger, better, and more impactful in the lives of those living with Alzheimer's disease. Our funding strategy is that we provide funding for new and innovative ideas in the early stages. So we seed that research to ensure that these ideas don't get lost in kind of the competition, and they can accelerate their progress to ensure that they actually can be scaled as well to reach the people living with Alzheimer's and all other dementia. Now, we've also worked tirelessly to create unprecedented momentum to raise the public discussion of Alzheimer's and dementia in the United States. So we've worked to increase the federal funding for Alzheimer's and dementia research from the National Institute of Health. And our advocacy has recently helped secure this number needs to be updated. It's now $3.5 billion now for Alzheimer's and related dementia research from the NIH. Now, this comes on the heels of an extra $289 million that we just received. And it's worth noting that, in about 2011 or so, the amount of money going to Alzheimer's and dementia research at the federal level was about $400 million. So this represents a fantastic increase that is going to, there's a fantastic increase in research funding that is going to the scientists in the field who are working tirelessly to understand and one day potentially treat and maybe even cure this disease. So to get us started, I want to define the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia, because we get this question a lot. People tend to confuse the two. So dementia is a syndrome. It's a collection of symptoms. So it's what the person experiences, but it's not what causes the experience. Alzheimer's, on the other hand, is a biological cause of dementia. So dementia can be defined as when a person's cognition has declined to the point where it begins to interfere with their activities of daily living. So things such as, getting dressed, feeding yourself, taking your medication, and even handling your own finances. And it can be particularly debilitating because it robs a person of their independence. And we like to think of cognition as memory, but there are other aspects too, including your thinking, your judgment, your planning, and even your orientation to time and space can be affected by dementias. So there are also behavioral symptoms such as agitation, aggression, sleep disturbances, which I'll get to a little bit later in this talk, as well as depression, psychosis, and even hallucinations and delusions. And there are several causes of dementia, but Alzheimer's is the most common cause, accounting for about 60 to 80% of all causes. There are others too, including vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, and frontotemporal dementia. And even though I'm not going to, make this a total talk about, the biology of the disease, to help guide our conversation today, I want to talk about some of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, particularly 3 hallmarks of the disease. So the first is the deposition of a protein known as beta amyloid outside the cells of the brain, and then as well as the deposition of a protein known as tau inside the cells of the brain. So with these 2 processes, other things begin to happen in the brain as well, including things like inflammation, as well as changes to how the brain even uses energy. And that leads to the death of these brain cells. But these changes do not happen overnight. So Alzheimer's disease is a continuum. So in the beginning, there is an asymptomatic phase, or a so-called preclinical phase. And at this point, we're not seeing any symptoms in the clinic, but some of the changes in the biology that leads to the disease have started to happen. But it's also worth noting that as we all age, we'll go through some normal cognitive aging and subtle changes to our memory and cognition. This is a normal process. But what we're talking about here is a disease process. And the earliest clinically detectable stage of the disease is called mild cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's disease. So this is the stage that can be detected in the clinic. But again, all of these biological changes are going on at this stage of the disease. And for some individuals who do develop mild cognitive impairment, they'll go on to develop dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. Now, this progresses from the mild to the moderate to the severe dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. And each one of these is associated with increasing dependence on care partners, and increasing loss of independence and an inability to perform the activities of daily living. And I also, as part of this presentation, I wanted to make sure that, the audience had a chance to participate. So I threw in a couple of poll questions. So here's the first one for you. And I think Kelly is going to help us by launching the poll. So how many years before the symptoms appear may brain changes in Alzheimer's begin? So you just go ahead and answer the poll. I'm going to give it a few minutes, seconds here, sorry, to see what people are going with. Okay, interesting. I love seeing the results come through. But yeah, 150 if you answered, that's fantastic. So 27% of you said that 20 or more years before the symptoms start to appear is when you start seeing these changes, and that is correct. So the changes, and I think we can end the poll here. So the changes that are associated with the disease start to happen many, many years before we can see it in the clinic. And the best way to catch a disease, or to defeat a disease, is to catch a disease early. So in the past, what has been done in the clinic is to use a person's history and cognition to kind of diagnose the disease, right? But as I said, at that stage, that is super late in the course of the disease, right? People are progressing into the dementia stages of the disease. So what we want to do is to be able to catch the disease early in the course of its progression. So that preclinical or the asymptomatic phase of the disease, so that we have the best chance of providing benefit for people with potentially living with Alzheimer's, or potentially going to develop the disease. So I think it's easiest for you to just see this accumulation in action. So this is modeling that is done from the dominantly inherited Alzheimer's disease network study. So this is Diane modeling, and what you're seeing at the top, and I'm going to replay this just so you have a chance to see it slower. But what you're seeing at the top is the accumulation of amyloid beta using brain imaging, and you could see that the changes start to happen many years before the estimated years of onset, as you see that ticker climb up. And what you see at the bottom is the death of these brain cells, which results in their reduced ability to use energy. So if I go back 1 second here, I think I can get this to play again. But as you can see, about 25 years or so before the estimated years to onset, you could see that there's changes. So as the color turns more red, it shows an increase in the accumulation. And you can see that these changes are happening in particular areas of the brain, especially the prefrontal cortex, as well as some of the temporal lobes. But you could see that these changes in the accumulation of this amyloid is correlated with the death of the neurons that leads to the reduced ability to use energy. So just an illustrative example here. But one thing that I do want to emphasize here, and well, one of the videos is not playing, but one thing that I do want to emphasize here is that we have made progress in our ability to image the brain to see these changes that happen when a person develops Alzheimer's or another dementia. So in red, you could see the amyloid beta plaques all over the brain. In blue, you see the tau tangles that I talked about. And in green, you see the brain cell death. Now, all of this is done using brain imaging, and this is expensive and hard to get a hold of in certain places. So what would be an accessible way to diagnose Alzheimer's disease would be a blood test. So blood tests are an exciting possibility because because with a simple test, you might have another tool that will aid in the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Now, previous work that has been presented at our international conference, AAIC, has shown some progress that is being made in this space. And in October 2020, a St. Louis-based company called C2N introduced Percivity 80, which is a test that is aimed at using a blood test to potentially help aid in the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Now, these blood tests are not in your doctor's office today, so that is important to note. We still have a long way to go in terms of having the appropriate validation in diverse cohorts before these can be brought to your doctor's office. But it represents tremendous progress in the field, and it's a very exciting time because if you had asked us 10, maybe 15 years ago that whether or not blood tests would be on the horizon, most people would have told you no. So the fact that we're at this point is truly exciting for our field. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the ideas that are being generated in the field regarding risk and risk reduction for Alzheimer's and other dementias. So although we've made tremendous progress in our understanding of the disease, we don't fully know what causes Alzheimer's disease. No one can tell you that doing this one thing or not will definitely give you Alzheimer's versus not. So the kind of risk factors that influence a person's risk of developing Alzheimer's disease fall into two broad categories. The biggest one being age. We know that the average age of onset for Alzheimer's disease is about 65 years or so. Genetics are very, very important. There are some genes that are deterministic, and there are others such as ApoE that increase your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, as well as race and ethnicity, as well as your, the sex and gender. And these are things that you can't really change. These are things that you can't really do anything about. But there are other risk factors, and these are the modifiable risk factors. So these include things that you can change. However, even though I'm saying that you can change these things, they may not be changed very easily, right? So for example, things like your environment, you can't just pick up and move. Even though you may be getting exposed to air pollution that I'll get to later as a potential risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. But there's other aspects to the modifiable risk factors too, like your diet, what you eat is very, very important. We know that the Mediterranean or the Mayan diet has been shown to potentially reduce risk. Getting sleep is very important, and I'll touch on that briefly in this presentation as well. Your cardiovascular health is key. We know what's good for the heart is good for the brain. Getting a good amount of physical activity and preventing traumatic brain injury, and also getting an education may help protect against Alzheimer's disease. Now, even though I list these risk factors in individual bubbles, they do interact with each other. And it's through these complex interactions of modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors that we get a person's overall risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So the constellation of reasons why a person may develop Alzheimer's may be fundamental and unique to each individual. And there's other aspects that we're just beginning to understand, such as the social determinants of health, that may also impact a person's ability to, a person's risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, highlighting the need for us to study risk from all angles. Now, I'm going to touch on a few of these, and the first that I want to touch on is gender, racial, and ethnic disparities in Alzheimer's prevalence in clinical and clinical trials. So almost 2/3 of Americans with Alzheimer's are women, and we still don't fully understand why this is the case. But we know that there's aspects of biology and life experiences that may be at play here. We also know from our Facts and Figures special report last year that discrimination is a barrier to getting care for dementia. But unfortunately, older Black Americans are 2 times as likely, and older Hispanic Americans are 1.5 times as likely as older whites to have Alzheimer's or another dementia. And to even make matters worse, these populations have been underrepresented in clinical trials. So in one of the most historic studies to image the brain, less than 5% of the participants were Black or Latino. And this is something that we've seen across many, many studies, even though the conversation is definitely moving along, and more studies are implementing efforts to improve the recruitment and retention of African Americans and Latinos in clinical trials. So, so this also underscores the need for us to understand what drives dementia in all people, so that the results of these clinical trials are generalizable to our diverse communities. Now, I promised you guys that I was going to talk a little bit about sleep, so I'm going to touch on that very, very briefly as a risk factor. So we all know that sleep is important for your general well-being. However, when it comes to understanding sleep as a potential risk factor for dementia, it's kind of interesting because it may not only be a consequence of dementia, but it might also contribute to the disease. And there's so many outstanding questions regarding how sleep may impact a person's risk of developing Alzheimer's or another dementia. But we're beginning to understand that. And one study that has been particularly informative is the Whitehall 2 study. This is a study out of the University College in London. And in this study, they started following the health and behavior of 10,000 UK civil servants for over 30 years. And this started in 1985. So when the study started, there was no interest in truly understanding dementia because the study participants were aged 35 to 55. So they're not truly the age that people get dementia. But today, those participants are 69 to 89. So they were able to draw on 30 years of data to understand what drives, how sleep may potentially drive a person's risk of developing dementia. But what they found is that short sleep was highly prevalent. with approximately 40% of individuals at the age of 60 having short sleep. And what they did find was that short sleep was associated with an increased risk of developing dementia. So 7% of short sleepers at the age of 60 went on to develop dementia, compared to the 5% of people who get 7 and 8 hours or more of sleep. Now, although this might seem like a small number, that represents an almost 40% or a 40% increase in the risk of developing dementia from this one risk factor alone. And also, people might be wondering that, with this increased understanding, how do we use it for interventions? So that's not necessarily a simple question either. So different approaches to improving sleep may have different impacts. So for example, in sleep apnea treatments, people use several treatments. So using continuous positive airway pressure has been associated with some improvements in cognition in the short term and a reduced risk of dementia in the long term. However, we have mixed evidence for medication for insomnia and how it may affect a person's dementia risk. And with regards to insomnia, Cbti is the preferred first-line therapy. Now, this is an accessible approach that teaches a person to calm their mind before going to sleep. And work done by a colleague of mine at the Alzheimer's Association found that Cbti reduced the severity, insomnia severity, as well as the cognitive complaints. But again, this is exciting work, and we need more work and how this might be applied in the long term. So one of the other things that I talked about was diet, and we've talked about the MIND diet and the Mediterranean diet, but fairly recently a study called the Cosmos Mind study was a large scale long-term clinical trial that looked at the potential of an extract supplement and a multivitamin to reduce the risk of developing dementia. And this was particularly surprising because it was a multivitamin and it showed that there was a 60% slowing of cognitive aging. And this was more pronounced in the people with cardiovascular disease. Again, this is very, very preliminary, and we need to understand more what is going on here. But it's exciting to see the role that diet plays in reducing a person's risk of developing dementia. So if I can get my slides to advance, I know that another risk factor that has been top of mind for all of us is COVID-19. So we're continuing to learn what the link between COVID-19 and the brain. And in this study, researchers examined the health records of 317,000 providers nationally. This represents about 20% of the US population. Again, this was early in the COVID days, but from the adults in this study, 1 million had dementia, and over 15,000 of them had COVID-19, and 810 had both. So what they found was that the risk of contracting COVID-19 was twice as likely for people with dementia in the study than those without. Among those with dementia, African Americans had close to 3 times the risk of getting COVID-19 as whites. Now, again, these are exciting, these are preliminary findings, but they highlight, again, the frightening reality of vulnerability associated with living with dementia. And again, they once again harp on these disparities that we keep talking about in our healthcare industry, as well as in dementia. And of course, there are a lot of theories that are flowing around, things like comorbidities such as hypertension and diabetes, cardiovascular risk, et cetera, might play a role. But it highlights the need for us to understand more about the intersection between Alzheimer's and COVID-19. So to help provide resources for those living with Alzheimer's and their families in these difficult times, the Alzheimer's Association launched a webpage with information. And we also launched a large global consortium of scientists from all over the world to understand the long-term impacts of COVID-19 on the brain. And whoops, we can forward that. And we also learned from our international meeting this past year that people with Alzheimer's had worse psychological symptoms due to the quarantine from the pandemic. However, engaging with people through texting or emailing with friends was associated with a decrease in low mood for those 75 and older. Also, COVID was found to lead to persistent cognitive deficits, or the long COVID that we keep hearing about in the news, as well as the acceleration of Alzheimer's pathology. Once again, I just want to emphasize that we're in the early stages of understanding what the impact of COVID on the brain, and much more research is needed. So another aspect of risk that was reported at our international meeting was on air pollution, which I touched on briefly on the risk slide. So previous research has linked long-term air pollution exposure with the accumulation of Alzheimer's disease-related brain plaques and an increase in the risk of dementia. But at this meeting, researchers reported that reductions in fine particulate matter was associated with the reduction in dementia risk for older women. Also, long-term exposure of air pollution was associated with higher levels of amyloid beta in the blood. And again, we've known for some time that air pollution is bad for our health, including our brains. But these new data are some of the first to suggest that improving air quality might reduce the risk of developing dementia. And again, these studies show an association, but they're not definitive proof. But they were conducted in very large study populations, lending some credibility. But this research can help provide the evidence for federal and local governments and businesses to help reduce the risk of reduce the concentration of air pollutants and increase the air quality to help increase overall health. Now, another piece that I want to talk about is the impact of environment, particularly where you live. So this map on the left was generated from state level data from facts and figures. And as you can see, certain areas such as Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, all have fairly high mortality rates. And at our international conference this year, we had a story focus on mortality in rural areas in the South between 1999 and 2019. And despite the increases in the average lifespan over the past several decades, there's been an increasing divergence in mortality rates among urban and rural populations. So rural areas in the United States have higher mortality rates from Alzheimer's compared to the urban areas. And in some areas, it can be as high as twice the mortality rate when you compare rural versus urban. Now, another study that was presented at our international conference looked at the global prevalence of Alzheimer's disease. Now, as I mentioned, dementia may disproportionately affect rural communities, especially in the US South. And researchers estimate that the number of people with dementia globally will nearly triple to more than 152 by 2050. And there are some positive trends in terms of the increase to global education access, and this is meant to decrease the dementia prevalence. But there's other negative trends, such as higher BMI, higher blood sugar intake, as well as smoking. All of those may potentially increase the risk of developing Alzheimer's and other dementia. So again, I like to keep these interesting. So I put another poll question. So we can launch the poll. According to the Lancet Commission, what % of dementia cases could be prevented or delayed by targeting modifiable risk factors? Okay, I want to see the answers roll in. Interesting. Also gives me a chance to have a coffee break. Okay, so according to 48% of you, 40% of the dementia cases could be prevented or delayed by targeting modifiable risk factors. And that is correct, actually. So this is a study that, this is a report that was published in 2020, and it did a survey of the evidence that we have for the modifiable risk factors, and found that 40% of global dementia may be preventable. So again, there's an updated figure with looking at the kind of aspects across the lifespan, but things that increase cognitive brain reserve. So we know we've heard stories about hearing, we've heard about education, some cognitive training. Exercise is an important one. Also things like reducing brain inflammation, and it's something that I'll talk about later. Your diet is absolutely critical, and just it's impactful to see a single number be put on all of these modifiable risk factors, but it's also very powerful to understand how what can be done versus what we can't change in terms of reducing the risk of developing dementia. So the big question that we do have to answer is, what would happen if we layer on additional components of a lifestyle intervention approach to reduce the risk for cognitive decline? So this is why the Alzheimer's Association is conducting a landmark multi-domain lifestyle intervention clinical trial in the United States called the US Pointer Study. So this is the first study of its kind ever to be conducted in the US, but it builds off a successful trial that was conducted in Finland called the FINGER trial. And this found that a multi-domain lifestyle intervention can reduce the risk of cognitive decline in elderly at-risk Finnish individuals. So the US Pointer study will test whether two lifestyle interventions encouraging physical exercise, a healthy diet, cognitive and social activities, and health monitoring can help reduce the risk of memory changes in older adults at risk for memory loss. Now, there will be two lifestyle interventions compared, a self-guided and a structured group. And this intervention will take place over 2 years in 2,000 participants across 5 geographically diverse clinical US sites. So the positive trial results might help inform an accessible and sustainable community-based lifestyle program for risk reduction. Now, this is a landmark study, and the Alzheimer's Association has already invested $35 million into this study, but the National Institute on Aging has also funded other studies that looking at the impact of sleep, the vascular contribution, so looking at the blood vessels that supply the brain with blood, as well as things like the interaction between the gut microbiome and the brain. In total, this all makes the study about $100 million study. Now, I want to switch gears really quickly to talk about some of the progress that is being made in terms of coming up with effective therapies for Alzheimer's and other dementia. But to understand why it takes such a long time for new therapies to be developed, I just want to talk about some of the challenges that some of these labs are facing. So science takes a long time, right? If you think about the drug development pipeline or the drug development process, you start in some kind of preclinical model, and then you have to move it you have to find a target, takes 10 to 15 years to move from the lab to the bench side, all the way through the FDA approval process. So we need to come up with new mechanisms of action. The drug delivery approaches are important because if you're thinking about the brain, it's covered by a protective barrier. So making sure that the right amount of drug gets to the brain, the site of action that you want your drug to act is important. So this is why there's such a huge need for funding of basic research to help fuel new therapies. So just to give you an idea of what the development pipeline kind of looks like. So in the preclinical phase of development, this is lab experiments. So this is what is done in a lot of universities. So they test their ideas in cellular and animal models. And then after they come up with an idea, they validate it in these models. They then then go into what's called phase 1 clinical trials. So this tests it in human volunteers. These are healthy volunteers to make sure that there are no make sure that there are no side effects that are dangerous to potential people taking who are going to be taking the drug. Now, this takes about a couple of months to complete your phase 1 studies. Then you move on to the phase 2 studies, where you test in significantly more individuals, and you get more information about the safety and what dose you want to give the drug at in your phase 3 study to make sure that you can establish the efficacy of your drug. And then in your phase 3 study, that could take years to decades, you typically have about 2 trials with a similar design, and you test with even more, potentially thousands of volunteers. And this provides the strongest evidence for the review at the FDA. So to give you a timeline of the progress that has been made in our field, so Alzheimer's disease was first described in 1906 by Alois Alzheimer's. Now, since his description of Alzheimer's disease, then it took 90 years before the first treatment came to market. So Aricept or donepezil was approved in 1996. Now, Aricept, Exelon, Razidine, Namenda, and Namzarac are all symptomatic treatments. So what that means is that they only treat the symptoms of the disease. So they only turn up the communication between the brain cells. But all that time, all of the other aspects of the disease, like the amyloid beta accumulation, the inflammation, all of those are still going on. So they don't do much to slow or modify the disease. However, in June of last year, about a year ago, the FDA granted accelerated approval to aducanumab. And I know a lot of you have heard about that potentially in the news. And this is the first accelerated approved drug for Alzheimer's disease that targets the underlying biology of the disease. Now, I know there's been a lot of controversy in the field, but regardless, it's an exciting time because for the first time, we're at a point where we are treating the disease in a way that we haven't done before since its discovery. But this is no longer a symptomatic treatment. This is one that has the potential to modify the disease. Now, I keep talking about these so-called anti-amyloid drugs. So what is the biology behind kind of these drugs? So if you look on the left here, you could see what are called the amyloid beta monomers. So these are cleaved off a specific protein on the cells of the brain, and they can accumulate in a number of different ways, right? It's a dynamic process, so it can go through making smaller species like the protofibrils or the oligomers, and all the way down to the bigger kind of plaques that are seen in on brain imaging. But it's also key to understand that these can they can kind of transition between states, right? Making for a very dynamic process that can lead to plaque formation. And the reason why I want to talk about this specific biology is that um, there are 4 other anti-amyloid drugs coming down the pipeline. So Gantenarimab, we're expecting these readouts in the next 18 or so months. So we have Gantenarimab, donanemab, lecanemab, and solanezumab. And although they're all called anti-amyloid drugs, they target different species of amyloid. And they have, even though they do show similar kind of effects on cognition, they do have kind of slightly different mechanisms of action you want to say. But what is exciting is that these are all in late phases of development, the phase 3 that I talked about. So they will be reading out soon and potentially adding to the toolkit of treatments for people living with Alzheimer's disease. But that's not all. So currently there are over 100 unique therapies being tested in clinical trials. Now, these target multiple aspects of the Alzheimer's biology. So obviously there's drugs looking at the amyloid beta and the tau, but there's also drugs looking at the communication between the brain cells. Also looking at things like the misfolded proteins. These proteins tend to misfold while they aggregate, as well as the molecules that the cells use to communicate between each other, how the genes are regulated. Also things like how the cells use energy. If you remember from one of the earlier slides, these cells tend to die and use less energy. And even oxidative stress and the inflammation in the brain. All of these are being tested to provide potential therapies for Alzheimer's and other dementia. And it's important that we test all of these biologies because no single drug is going to be a silver bullet, right? We need powerful combination therapies that address multiple aspects of the disease biology to provide the maximum benefit for people. But with all of these trials, we need your help. We can't reach effective therapies without clinical trial volunteers. It is estimated that the number of people needed to the number of people needed to complete all of the clinical trials that are ongoing for Alzheimer's treatments alone is about 50,000 or so. So don't just hope for a cure, help us find one. The Alzheimer's Association has introduced Trial Match, which is a free, easy to use clinical trials matching service. You don't have to create an account. You just go on the website and you can search through clinical studies that you're eligible for. There are online studies as well that will help us come up with better tools for understanding the disease. But in this new era of treatment for Alzheimer's disease, we need to track how these drugs are doing in the real world, right? Clinical trials are very, very idealized situations. So in a clinical trial, people are getting consistent amyloid PET scanning, they're getting constant access to their doctors, but that's not the case in the real world. So how are these drugs going to be, how are these drugs going to perform? And that's to track that, that progress in the real world. The Alzheimer's Association has also introduced ALZNet, which is the Alzheimer's National Registry for Treatment and Diagnostics. This is a provider registry, so we're partnering with the physicians to see how these therapies that are approved by the FDA perform in the real world, track, the side effects as well as, the efficacy of these drugs. But the importance of developing new therapies for Alzheimer's can be illustrated specifically in this one graphic. It is estimated that if we can develop a treatment by 2025 that delays the onset of Alzheimer's by just 5 years, 5.7 million people who are expected to develop Alzheimer's in 2050 won't. So that's extremely powerful, thinking about the number of caregivers that will reduce the burden on, thinking about the reduction in the cost of the healthcare infrastructure. But also, it's likely that treatment will probably be a combination of powerful combination therapies, and even using risk reduction strategies to further help delay the onset of Alzheimer's disease. So we are on an interesting road to our vision of a world without Alzheimer's and all other dementia. But everything that we do every day is a crucial step on this road to this very important vision. All of our studies, all of the research being done, and all of the initiatives being led by the association are helping to lead towards achieving that vision. Now, in closing, I just want to leave a couple of Alzheimer's Association resources. So, of course, we have our 24/7 helpline, 1-800-272-3900. This is a great place for information, also care consultations, and the master's level clinicians available 24/7, and they offer support in 200 languages. The alz.org website is a great source of information. And also in your community, there are several resources that are available through the Alzheimer's Association website. And with that, I want to also say that you can download the Science Hub app, which is it's an app developed by the marketing communications team at the Alzheimer's Association, which delivers viewpoints and research developments in easy to understand language. Now, with that, I'd like to say thank you for your attention today, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Dr. Griffin, on behalf of all of us who are here this evening, let's give you a virtual round of applause. Thank you very much. That was a lot of information that you managed to pack into 60 minutes. So thank you for doing that. Are we still saying there's an app for that? Because there is an app for that. And I love the research app. I think it's an absolute great resource to have at your fingertips. So I know we are looking at questions. We've been monitoring the Q&A section of our Zoom here for questions, and we do have some questions for you. I do think we will have some time for a number of questions for you, so we'll try to field as many as we possibly can. So again, I encourage folks, please use the Q&A section of the Zoom down at the bottom there rather than the chat. Sometimes questions get lost in the chat. So again, please put your questions in the Q&A. So Kelly, I think we'll turn it over to you to start leading us through questions. Kelly and Company.
Yeah, so thank you for Christina, and thank you so much, Dr. Griffin. It's a pleasure to have you in our area and to be able to present this information to our volunteers and constituents here in the Delaware Valley and Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey. I will start out. I have two questions that I want to start out with. We did have some of our registrants submit some questions in advance of tonight's program. And I think I'm going to ask this question in a way that might cover several that have been posed this evening. What role does genetics, or do genetics play in an individual's risk for developing Alzheimer's disease?
Sure, that's a great question, Kelly, and thanks for asking that. So genetics are one of those non-modifiable risk factors that I talked about during the presentation, and it really depends on the genes you're talking about. So there are certain genes called the so-called deterministic genes. these are genes in, these are mutations in specific parts of proteins such as the APP protein and others that if a person tests positive for this, they have almost certainty that they're going to develop Alzheimer's disease. And that's what's being studied in the dominantly inherited Alzheimer's disease study, right? And typically this is passed down from generation to generation. And yeah, typically what happens is that people's parents will have that mutation, and whatever age that a person whatever age that the parent developed the disease at, the person is probably going to develop it at that same age. So that's what allows us to do that kind of modeling of the years of onset. So those are the deterministic genes. But then there's other genes that increase your risk of developing Alzheimer's. So things like the ApoE gene that people have also heard about. With all of those though, and apart from the deterministic genes, they all only influence the risk of developing Alzheimer's and never actually doom anyone to develop Alzheimer's, right? There's the modifiable risk factors that can help reduce a person's risk of developing Alzheimer's. So it's an interplay between genes and the environment, as well as your age, to kind of determine if on whether or not a person is going to develop Alzheimer's disease.
Thank you, Dr. Griffin. I'll lead into a second question, and I think you showed or highlighted some of these on some of your slides this evening, but can you speak a little more to any potential therapies or treatments that are in the research pipeline?
Yes, so I talked about the anti-amyloid drugs. Those are the ones that are kind of in the latest stages of development. So lecanemab, gantenarimab, donanemab, and solanezumab are they're ones that are in the later stage in the phase 3 clinical trial. So hopefully in the next 18 or so months, we'll be getting readouts on them. But there's also other things like the anti-tau drugs that are coming through the pipeline, and also drugs that are looking at inflammation. So the reason why all of these are so exciting is that the best approach is probably going to be combination therapies, right? Combining, an amyloid drug with a tau drug, or an amyloid drug with an inflammation drug to target the different aspects of the biology. And all of these are under active investigation. I forgot to mention, but the Alzheimer's Association funds some of this research through the CLOUD program. This is an innovative funding program that tests kind of these non-traditional mechanisms of disease to come up with potential therapies. So lots to hope for on the horizon, but it's certainly an interesting time in terms of therapies that change the underlying biology of the disease.
Great, thank you. Before we move on to some of our chat and Q&A questions, I just do want to mention we have a lot of questions that have come in, and our staff are diligently trying to go through all of them. In the interest of time this evening, we won't be able to address all of them. And I will say that anyone who has posted any questions that might be more related to care needs or resources, or information about stages of the disease and those type of things, I would encourage anyone and everyone on the webinar tonight to please make use of our 24/7 helpline. We have master's clinicians at that number round the clock, 365 days a year, who can address those questions, offer support, offer resources, and more information. So if we don't get to your question, certainly please use our helpline, but we're going to try to keep our questions focused on the topic for tonight of research and science. So with that being said, Brittany, do we have anything from, or let's start with the Q&A. Lindsay or Brittany, do we have anything Any questions we want to address from the Q&A?
Actually, Kelly, there's one that I think I probably should address. So this is from one of the participants talking about a virtual webinar highlighting early onset due to genetic mutations. And I think the reason why I want to address this is because the Alzheimer's Association I didn't have time to dive into that, but the Alzheimer's Association is part of the leadership and is also working with others at the Indiana University on what is called the longitudinal early onset disease study, or the LEAD study. So this is a natural history study to understand there's a natural history study to understand the progression of early onset Alzheimer's disease and non-Alzheimer's disease dementia. So each year we also have what is called a family meeting. So the family meeting brings together caregivers, family members, and people living with cognitive impairment to talk about the experience of living with early onset Alzheimer's disease. Now, why this is such an important and different kind of population of people with Alzheimer's is because, first of all, they have very different considerations. People who develop Alzheimer's that early are probably at the height of their careers, as opposed to, the late onset version. So for more information on that, we actually put some of the recordings from the first family meeting up on the website. So if you look up the LEAD study and go to the website, there is some information on the early onset version, and we're still working to understand what the genes are and what the progression is for this version of Alzheimer's disease. So I just wanted to answer that one quickly before we moved on.
No, thank you, Dr. Griffin. So if anybody's interested in early onset, they can go to alz.org and they can type LEADS, LEADS, in the search bar, and they will find that page. And Abby, I don't know if somebody has time to, I'm sharing my screen, but if somebody has time to maybe pull that link from the website and drop it in the chat, that would be great.
Yeah, Abby, just put that in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So back to, I believe, Lindsay, are you monitoring Q&A, the Q&A box? And do we have any questions we want to address with Dr. Griffin from the Q&A?
Yeah, we can get started. Let me find the first question. So what are the benefits of an early diagnosis of dementia?
That's a great question. We get that question a lot because there's kind of this hesitancy to get an early diagnosis, but an early diagnosis allows a person to put their affairs in order, right? Because sometimes the diagnosis kind of creeps up on people. And why it's important to get an early diagnosis is that with most of these drugs coming down the pipeline, actually, they are targeting the early stage of the disease. So having a diagnosis early makes sure that you're eligible for these potential drugs coming down the pipeline. But also it allows us to implement any risk reduction strategies that might help slow down the decline. So and also it allows you to plan with your family to monitor exactly what is happening with different life changes, like things like losing your ability to drive. All of that planning, it's important to have an early diagnosis to be able to put that infrastructure in place for your care moving forward.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Griffin. Our next question, I hope I pronounced this correctly. Rebio CSF amyloid beta test was recently approved through the FDA's pre-market review pathway. Does this mean that this test can now be used to detect amyloid beta in CSF? Is this a diagnostic test for Alzheimer's?
Yes, that is a good question. Someone definitely pays attention to the news there. So the Fujirebio test is an interesting one because they've been working very closely with the FDA for a while, and they've been kind of following the appropriate stringent standards of a regulatory path to get approval for a cerebrospinal fluid test. So yes, it did get approved, and yes, it's a test to aid in the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. That being said, no single test alone can tell you whether or not you have Alzheimer's disease. This is part of all of these tests that we talk about, blood tests, the imaging, all of that has to be part of a full workup of, using cognitive screening as well as family history to understand to get an accurate diagnosis. So it's another tool that we have in our toolkit. They did a very rigorous process, and it's actually the first one to get that clearance from the FDA for marketing. So it's true progress in our field because again, spinal taps they're very ubiquitous. So it's easy to get one, even though there's a little bit of hesitation around them, and they're less expensive than a PET scan would be. So very, very, it's great progress for the field indeed.
Okay, great. Thank you. Our next question, can dementia progression be prevented?
Currently, we don't have treatments that do that, right? That's kind of the unfortunate part about dementia, is that once you reach that stage, it just progresses to a terminal stage. So dementia progression cannot be prevented. Hopefully in the future we can, with our increasing understanding of the disease, but so far that's not the case.
Okay, next question. What is the outlook for trials and treatments for early onset Alzheimer's?
So I just talked about the lead study, which is looking to understand early onset Alzheimer's disease, and that's a big one. So, and the reason why it's so huge too is that it's looking at the genetics of the disease and also trying to understand the progression to come up with targets that could potentially be studied later for clinical trials. So the lead study is leading the way, but certainly I think that we're still a few years out before we truly understand that. And it's tougher because I think the number of people who have early onset Alzheimer's disease is about 300,000 a year. So it's a smaller population to study, but it's definitely something that we're taking very seriously at the association and in the field as well.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, can you touch on the traumatic brain injury and its relationship to dementia?
Yeah, so with even like a stroke or whatever else, anything that kind of leads to death of the brain cells can increase your risk of developing dementia, right? Because dementia is essentially, from the biological standpoint, is the death of those brain cells that leads to cognitive function that allows you to do these activities of daily living. So with a traumatic brain injury, what happens there is that there's a blunt force or continuous blunt force that leads to death of these brain cells. And what happens there is that it starts to kill off these brain cells, and it reduces the connection between these brain cells that lead to cognition. And so that's how traumatic brain injury might increase your risk of developing dementia. But it's also worth mentioning that even though we do know that, there's kind of mixed results in the literature. People sometimes find it, people don't. People find that it might lead to more inflammation that leads to brain death. So people talk more about CT, which is chronic traumatic encephalopathy, as a result of traumatic brain injury. But again, we need to understand more to fully know what the link is. We know a link is there, but more research is needed.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there any way to provide any resources about the dietary recommendations to potentially decrease the incidence or progression of dementia?
Yeah, I will defer to others on the panel. I think we have some pages on the Alzheimer's Association website about this, so I think someone can put that in the chat.
Yes, I do believe that our facts and figures report is the best place to go for that information. So I know Abby can drop that link in the chat. Thank you, Dr. Griffin.
Okay, our next question, and this may not be a research question, but do we know what the size of the unknown dementia related deaths?
I don't know what the question is specifically here.
I believe we're referring to, do we know what the potential is of basically mortality rates with dementia if it's not a specifically listed cause of death on, say, a death certificate?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. We're not sure. We definitely know that dementia's, Alzheimer's is severely underdiagnosed. So let's just start there. I think it's 50% is the rate of diagnosis. It's also listed in our facts and figures. So yeah, we again, we can't quantify that because it's not listed on the death certificates, but yeah, that's a good question as well. But yeah, well, we don't really have a way of knowing that.
Okay, thank you. Do you have an opinion on when there may be a substantial treatment or cure in the future?
So I don't have a specific opinion on, the treatment pipeline necessarily. All I just want to say is that it's very exciting that we're at this stage at all in Alzheimer's disease treatment and research at all, right? Getting to a stage where we have disease modifying therapies is huge for the field. As to when these come to market, when what progress is being made, all of the different targets and the timelines for the clinical trials, all of those are under the control of the clinical trial sponsors. The forces that we can't control, like COVID, think that may have had an impact on clinical trials recruitment and retention. So I don't have a specific opinion. I'm just excited that we have so many shots on goal at all to potentially come up with options for people living with Alzheimer's disease.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Griffin. That is actually our last question.
Perfect.
We've we've run up on our time here, Dr. Griffin. We had a lot of questions coming through and we tried to field as many as we possibly could. I know we didn't get to all of your questions, but as Kelly said, we will definitely follow up on those that we are able to provide answers on, and any other support that we can provide to those of you who had some questions specifically around what we'd say the 24/7 helpline. So you'll see here up on the screen, the second bullet, our Alzheimer's Association 24/7 helpline is a resource for hundreds of thousands of people every year, and that is there for you around the clock. So please take advantage of it. As Kelly described earlier, we've got master's level clinicians who are able to answer questions in more than 200 languages. This evening's program has really been about research, and so we tried to field as many of the questions as we could that were focused on that content, but there are many other resources beyond this webinar and our focus on research this evening. And if you'd like to learn how the Alzheimer's Association is engaging in your community, or if you would like to be involved in the work that we're doing, whether that's through advocacy or getting connected to the care and support services in your community, educational programs, support groups. We would love to be able to partner with you in those ways and connect with you in those ways in your communities. You will receive a survey after this program this evening. As well, we will make the YouTube link available for the recording of this evening's session. So you will receive that information in a follow-up email. You can share that with others. We please encourage you to pass that along to others in your network who may be touched by dementia. So thank you one more time for your time this evening with us. Thank you so much to Dr. Griffin, and thank you to all of our staff who were able to support the program this evening. We would not be able to do this program without all of our amazing staff working across Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, but specifically those of you who are able to support us this evening. Thank you so very much. Thank you, Dr. Griffin. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to being connected in your community with you. Thank you so very much. Take care, everyone.